discussion on strategizing for the future of business education. Today, in alignment with our theme of rethinking corporate strategy in the age of paradox, we will witness a panel discussion on strategic leadership in times of disruption and intense global competition. Before we move on to the plenary today, I would like to make a few housekeeping announcements. I would like to request all of you to kindly keep your phones on silent. We have the Wi-Fi details and other important contacts at the back of your name badges. Should you need any help, our volunteers from the organizing team will be around to help you. Now, I would like to invite Professor Harbir Singh to welcome the panelists. Professor Harbir Singh is the William and Phyllis Mack Professor of Management and co-director of the Mack Center for Technological Innovation at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. His main areas of research are the strategic alliance and network formation, alliance management, corporate acquisitions, management buyouts, and corporate restructuring. Please put your hands together to welcome Professor Harbir Singh.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak from here and introduce the panel. First of all, what I wanted to say was that it is just a great privilege and pleasure to be here at ISB hosting the primary global conference on strategy in 2018. And having been fortunate to be involved with ISB when this was red soil and boulders over here, when the campus was first inaugurated, I think it has come a very, very long way. And it is because of the leadership and because of the faculty and also because of the kinds of students that ISB has been able to admit and who've gone to do great things. So it's wonderful to be here. I wanted to say a little bit about the theme of this panel and then introduce our panelists and also a little bit on just how we'll run the panel. So the theme of the conference as a whole is strategy in an age of paradox. What we're talking about here is strategy in an age of global competition and turbulence. And specifically the turbulence we're talking about is in the velocity of change that we see in today's environment. And in particular, I think one of the most overused and perhaps poorly used words in management jargon today is disruption. And I think, but that's used because of the high velocity of change and how it leaves many strong incumbents by the wayside several years later. So one of the questions we will think about is strategizing in the face of technological discontinuities. But the other issue we'll talk about is global competition, and one of the tensions we'll talk about is a tension between the idea of global convergence, which is what we have, in a sense, the implicit principle of teaching in a business school, is that the practices we teach may apply across the globe in different ways with minor alterations. So global convergence is a hypothesis that says most markets tend to converge in terms of the key success factors, and firms converge in terms of the ways they might compete over there in those markets. However, the competing argument is really one of evolution in local contexts that results in local practices and local strategies and so on. And of course, even in the global strategy literature, there's the global versus multi-domestic. But I prefer the idea of global convergence on management practice versus evolutionary local paths. And that's one tension we'll talk about. The second issue we'll talk about is the role of agility in organizations and the need for agility. Many of the concepts we talk about in strategy talk a lot about being deliberate and making good choices and then organizing for those choices. And then the other side of the tension is to move fast in response to market change. And I think the question here really is one of how can you be agile and make good choices and also at the same time go ahead of the market or at least keep up with the market. A third issue, which is actually applicable both in the US and overseas, in India certainly, is corporate governance in a way needs to be rediscovered and reconceptualized. I think in India we've had some of the most celebrated companies and organizations, the Tatas and Infosys, having very public governance battles. At the same time, in the US, we have a dramatic change, which is the number of public companies in the US has declined substantially in the last 5 years. And so the private equity market has really become a major alternative even for large organizations. So one of the things we'll talk about is what are the new ways of thinking about corporate governance as we think about global markets. And finally, what I would like to do is to think about, and this is unique to the Indian context, think about concepts on scaling strategies. I think India is a high growth market, and so how do you scale with fidelity? How do you execute well while scaling for a high growth market with demographic factors in its favor is the fourth concept. So with those sort of general remarks, I just wanted to briefly introduce our speakers. Mr. D. Shivakumar on my extreme left is the Group Executive President for Corporate Strategy at the Aditya Birla Group. And he also has actually many accomplishments that lead to this. He was the chairman and CEO of Pepsi India. He was also leading Nokia in India as managing director, and before that in Hindustan Lever in India as well. And he is a distinguished, actually I noticed he was a distinguished alumnus from IIT Madras, but also a distinguished alumnus from IIM Calcutta. So the two institutions both conferred on you their highest award. Mr. Sri Rajan is the chairman of Bain in India, and has had 20 years in India in experience, as well as a similar, not quite as long stint in the US. So he comes with a global perspective, and he has his degree from IIM Calcutta and the Wharton School, and he suffered through my class and has lived to tell the tale. So that's really good. But I think what Sri I think has, I'll just give you one quick summary statement that we brought a group of faculty to India for an immersion project to learn about India, and we met many people over the course of 7 days, and our 1-hour meeting with Sri was by their view the most insightful. So Sri has some really succinct ways of thinking, and in particular I'm hoping that Sri will talk about private equity in India. And then on my immediate left is Professor Zaheer from the University of Minnesota, and he has been teaching the corporate strategy course at ISB since the very beginning for the last 20 years. And Axe, that is really a wonderful contribution. Axe and I taught for the first 10 years together, and we taught the first class of 120 over here, and so have fond memories about that. But he's also a leading scholar on strategy and organization. Some of his work on trust is very widely cited, not just by academics. I was in Japan and in a discussion around strategy, and somebody talked about Machiavelli and Zaheer on trust. So there's a global reach. So with that, what we'll do is we'll hear from Mr. Shivakumar right away, and then he unfortunately has to leave to catch a flight, and then we will have Sri and Axe. Do you want to just?
Okay. My pleasure to be here. What a difference 10 years makes. 2008, I was here on this stage with C.K. Prahlad. It was a pleasure to do this session for him. I'm here. Now I actually do a strategy role. Those days I was CEO of Nokia. Okay. Now why am I here? I must have read most books which were worthy of reading in strategy over the last 30 years. I'll give you my point of view. Okay. I will not give you an academic point of view. Okay. But I'll give you a practitioner point of view of somebody who's run businesses and who's seen it, okay, evolve over the last 25, 30 years, okay? So, first up, if you look at strategy, if you got your strategy right, then you should be running your company right, okay? That's my simple basic premise. So, let's look at 10 years, the most admired companies of, okay, the most admired companies of 2008, and take a look at the most admired companies of 2018. Apple, Berkshire Hathaway, FedEx, and Microsoft are the only 4 which have been on this list of most admired companies over 10 years. A lot of people tell you that the Fortune 500 list or the S&P 500 list, 1/3 churn out every decade. 1/3. Now the churn out at the top, at the very top, is twice that rate. Okay, so you have to better get everything right for you in order to continue to be an admired company. And you cannot be an admired company if you don't have your strategy right or you're not making the right moves. I just took parallel from sport and said, let me look at a sport. Let's look at tennis as an example. And let's look at tennis. It's the same ratio. 4 guys who were there in 2008 in the top 10 continue to be in the top 10 even in 2018. So the attrition rate for tennis players in the top 10 is exactly the same as the attrition rate for the most admired companies in the top 10. Okay? In many other games, the attrition rate is even higher. Okay? The top 10 in most of the games, just, maybe just 2 guys continue. Now, in the most admired list of 2008 was a company called GE. Okay, now I argue with you, is GE a case study of death due to strategy, or disruption, or competition, or capital allocation, or execution, or culture, or all of them? Something must have horribly gone wrong if GE is where it is today, right? The most admired company of 2008. They must have really got their strategy wrong. Okay, so that's my point for you to think about. Let's look at the graveyard of companies who got strategy wrong. HP, AMD, Sears, Compaq, Kodak, JCPenney, Blockbuster, Yahoo, Sony. So, question here. What were the strategy teams? What were the leadership team? And what are the consultants doing wrong here? Okay? It's good for us to reflect on these kind of things. Let's look at an industry which everything went wrong. All the big players in the industry got it wrong. Okay? So you have BlackBerry, you have Nokia, you have Palm, and everybody there. Everyone got it wrong, and Motorola. Okay, whole industry got disrupted. Okay? And I mentioned to you, Nokia in 2008, when I did the speech here, and at the same podium, was ranked number 23 in the world in terms of most admired companies. And I was very proud to belong to that kind of set. Okay, now a lot of people think that this is all global, India, no change, etc. I'm going to show you data from India for the first time, okay, which I've gathered over time, but I won't give you the names, but you can figure it out. So if you look exactly 15 years ago, in soaps, the category leader in soaps in India, I won't name the company, had 63% market share. That same company today has 39% market share. In shampoos, the category leader then had 62 share. Today they have 45. In tea, the category leader had 54%. Today there's a different category leader with a market share of 19. In mobile phones, the category leader had 40. Today it's 20. Airlines, the category leader had 40, which was Air India then, I think. Now it's 20 plus. In deodorants, the category leader was 70. Today we have a new category leader at 20. And the category leader who was 70, today is at 9. So here's my hypothesis to you. In 2000s, early 2000, category leaders had 60 share. Today they have 35 to 40 share. In 5 years from now, they'll have 20 share. While the business has grown, the sheer competitive strength has declined. And when you lose 1 point share every year, you don't realize it. It's only when you step back after 15 years, you say, my God, what a fundamental change. This has not happened because of global competition, ladies and gentlemen. It's happened because of local competition. Across the world, global companies are losing to local companies. In America, people are losing to small companies from small geographies. The big companies are not the one winning. The big companies have all the resources, the small companies have all the hunger. That's the fundamental difference. Or as the professor said, the big companies have strategic ability, the small companies have strategic agility. That's the fundamental difference. Okay, and that's what's happening out there. Okay? Next, the harsh and stark reality of today. Profitable growth is hard to come by. Capital, technology, easily available off the shelf. Talent is attracted by challenge and fungible. Investors, stakeholders, boards want fast action and faster results. The GE CEO, the board told him 14 months, but you didn't move fast enough. In the past, you would have 10 years and people would say, you still have time. 14 months and they told him you're not fast enough. Okay, imagine if you're running such a conglomerate. And society is placing its rightful demands. Now, here's where I believe a lot of strategy work has come in the past from professors, okay, whether or thinkers like Ansoff, okay, Arnoldo Hacks, etc., etc. Where has strategy gone wrong? Let's look at the amount of jargon which strategy has churned out over the last 25 years. First, general jargon. Strategy books about purpose, vision, mission, generic strategy, specific strategy. Can't get more rubbish of that, right? Famous people, Iacocca strategy, Napoleon strategy, Bill Gates strategy. You put a name and then add strategy to it, then you have a book or a concept. Descriptive, offensive strategy, defensive strategy, all-out strategy. Color, for good measure. Blue ocean strategy, red ocean strategy, green strategy, code red strategy. I'm sure you can add purple strategy or what you want, okay? Numbers, 20,000 feet strategy, 365-day strategy, 90-day strategy, 180-day strategy, 360-day strategy. Aerospace, glide price strategy, lift-off strategy, strategy thrust. And finally, the best, which came from a consulting house. Your strategy needs a strategy. This is actually a true book, which came last year. So obviously, professors, practitioners, consultants have got everything wrong. Okay, or they've tried to decode it in their own funny way, okay, just to write a book. And that's my submission to you. It's not an easy thing. So let's go back. In the past, strategy was predictable. The world was predictable, and it was all about planning. And hence planning was centralized, precise, and directed. In this era, the past became a very powerful linear extrapolation tool. That's why a company like GE had 240 strategic planners. That's the reason. Because it was a stable world. You could extrapolate 2018 into 25, into 50, and by and large not be wrong. Okay? But that's not the case today. Today, it's completely different. In the past, the only thing which changed, even in my 30 years in my career, products change. Today, markets change, go-to-market changes, business models change. Okay? All of them change. And with technology, all four change. That's the real challenge. So the degree of dimension of change is absolutely humongous. So today's world is anything but stable is my first point to you. The pace of change is much more than what a human being or a human mind can digest. And hence, it's extremely difficult for even the brightest guy to extrapolate based on the amount of change which is significantly more than what he can do. So, where is strategy moving from? It's moving from planning in a stable world, having long periods of stability, strengthening our core was the logic of the past. Today's strategy is moving to what is emerging. What are the unknowns that we don't know about today? What could kill this industry? Okay? What could kill us in this industry? And what's the new core? In the past, we said, here's a core, innovate at the core, be incremental and keep growing. That philosophy was fine in the 1990s. Today, we are saying, we have a core we need to do well. We need to develop a new core which also needs to do well. So it's like Microsoft saying, I need a new core called cloud. I can't continue with my old core. So every business, and including you as professors and business schools, you have a current core. If you don't develop a new core, you won't have this SMS 5 years from now. Okay, that's my submission to you. So please develop a new core, even in the business school arena, okay? And I think that's something which is important for everybody to realize. So, the challenge is not that we don't know. I think a lot of smart people in companies know it. The thing is to ask, when is it time to change? Kodak had a digital camera in 1975. In the year 2009-10, a lot of us told the Nokia board and the CEO that, look, we need to go Android. It's an open system which is working. Application developers are developing apps on it. So when is the time to change? What do you need to change? And how do you need to change? Okay, so you have to ask those questions. Every organization, every institution needs to change. And that's the pivot on which you really need to think about. So, in summary, I want to leave you with 3 points. Number 1, all disruptors are innovators, not all innovators are disruptors. What you need to worry about is the disruptor, okay? And there's disruption happening in every industry, including yours, which is business school education. There's massive disruption happening even in your industry, okay? That's number 1 point to you. Number 2, we have to throw more simplicity at complexity. Throwing more complexity at complexity is the worst thing a business can do. But people, and especially leaders, like to be intellectually challenged, and they add layers and layers of confusion. Okay, the best leaders of tomorrow, the best strategists of tomorrow will bring simplicity to complexity, not add complexity to complexity. Okay, that's something which I believe will be important. And the third and the most important one, we have to move from an ecosystem that I know everything, I'm the boss, I've run this industry for 20 years, to start thinking about partnering in an ecosystem. So every ecosystem company will lose and lose very quickly. Every company which develops ecosystem partnerships will win and win handsomely. So those are the three things that I'd leave for you in terms of rethinking strategy. Okay, the truth in every company is out there somewhere. A bunch of people know the truth, but somehow the truth doesn't filter up in terms of what we need to change and when we need to change. Because it doesn't get filtered up, okay, we have lots of consultants, lots of academicians advising the CEO and the board of continuing what he's doing. Okay, and that's the real problem with strategy today. Okay, there is no truth which is coming up to challenge what's happening. Okay, in essence, that's the simplicity of it. I've run companies for 16 years. Trust me, I know the pain of this more than any of you can ever write a book on. Okay, so thank you and all the very best. Sorry I can't hang around. I had to go. I thought the original program was 11:15. I had to take a flight at 1, otherwise I would have changed it. Okay, my apologies. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. So we will move to Professor Zaheer, and thanks Mr. Shivakumar for that inspiring talk.
It's not working. Now it's working.
Is that better? Yeah. So thank you for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure, as I said, to be associated with ISP for 18, 19, and 20 years. I just wanted to, natural reaction of a person who spent 35 years in strategy is to counter some of the things that we heard, which is strategy dead? And if strategy is dead, what are we going to do with strategy dollars? So I don't quite think strategy is dead. I don't quite think that change is vastly different today than it has been. As we all know, Lynchburg says 40 years ago, the concept of emergent strategy is critical to strategy. So of course we can never predict the future. I agree completely on the point that the pace of change has speeded up. But the fact that things are changing unpredictably is really something that's taken for granted. Tout ça change, tout cela natural. As the French so wonderfully said, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Of course, we always know that. What's new, perhaps what's new, is how do we deal with the quickening. So I thought I would preface my talk by saying that things have changed. Things have changed in a way that we have seen some of these changes before, such as in the Smoot-Hawley legislation of the 1930s. And what do we have to do both as scholars and as business people when strategy has to deal with the change that we are seeing in the age of Trump? So that's a very quick title of the talk that I thought I'd give you some ideas about. So the first notion here is globalization, of course, has been seen as the culprit. Globalization has been seen as the cause of this enormous change. Globalization has been seen as the whipping boy, really. Because, of course, it is not globalization per se that has led to the situation that we see. So the situation that we see is, of course, we have lots and lots of people who feel disenfranchised, lots and lots of people who are taking opioids and committing suicide, and lots of people who are veering their countries and their social systems to the right. So globalization, of course, has been accused of being the culprit, but it is the advances in information technology, really. It is advances in different kinds of technologies that is the culprit, and of course that has led to what we see now and what has been mischaracterized as globalization. But the point is that even though globalization is not the culprit, the reaction to globalization is very real. So globalization is not the real culprit, but the reaction is real, and the reaction has to be dealt with both from a theoretical point of view and from a practical point of view. So the reaction has been so intense that it has changed the way that we think about strategy, or that we should be thinking about strategy, and it has changed the way that companies should think about how they should respond in a new global world. So very quickly, the reality is that there has been a drop in what we normally consider to be globalization, which is what is the flow of cross-border products, which has decreased, of course, in 2008 after the crash, but it never quite recovered. So if you look at that first picture, it never has gone back to where it was in 2008, and in fact, it has continued to decline. The drop in what we normally consider to be globalization has also occurred in FDI and securities and equities and other investments, as the rest of the charts show. So what do we do about it? How do we think about it? What should companies do about it? And what should we as academics do to incorporate this anti-globalization set of ideas, this anti-globalization trend, into our thinking of global strategy? So global strategy, as a lot of us who've taken courses, who teach courses in global strategy, in strategy, the most standard way of thinking about global strategy is, as Harbir was saying, the globally standardized strategies or the multi-domestic strategies. So those are the polar opposites. And as the world was getting more and more globalized, we saw more globally standardized strategies making sense. And the notion of the globally standardized strategy, which of course all of you know, is that a company makes the product in a central location, or one or two central locations in the world, and then ships it around the world. But that has come under pressure in today's world. So we cannot rely on a global strategy, a globally standardized strategy, where you have centers of excellence and you manufacture in one or two of those centers of excellence and ship it across the world. Because supply chains are under pressure. Supply chains are being tariffed. There are limitations in the movement of people across countries. So you can't, ship your people as easily. Think of Brexit. Think of Europe. Think of Hungary. Think of Italy. And so we have to adapt our global standardized strategies with flexible networks. You need more flexibility, and rather than ship the product from a central location all over the world, you need to be able to move in and out of different locations. So another big piece of global strategy is the transnational strategy. And the idea is here you adapt a global product, a globally standardized product for the local environments. But essentially, it's a standardized product. In today's world, that may no longer be possible because of the pressure of global supply chains, and you may have to be much more integrated into the local environments. We've just heard from Shiv how multinationals are more and more seeing local companies as competitors. And so dealing with that local competition means local integration rather than transnational adaptation. Two more ideas here. The third idea is that we are no longer able to see multinationals as dominating the nation states. So in the 60s and 70s, there was a famous movement in global strategy, in international business, where Ray Vernon wrote a book called Sovereignty at Bay. And the idea of sovereignty at bay was that multinationals were so powerful that they were going to dominate the nation states. that is no longer the case. Multinationals have no longer the power to dominate the nation state. The nation state, in fact, has acquired much greater power than it ever had and dominates multinationals in turn. And finally, the quite horrifying, frankly, notion that we are moving away from what Weber called the bureaucratic management system. We're moving away from universalism. We are moving to a much more particularistic model where we risk moving away from irrational management by taking decisions about companies and about economic actions on an ad hoc, one-off manner. And so what does that mean for our cultures, our national cultures? And certainly in the West, the national culture has been very much oriented toward a universalistic model rather than a particularistic model. So that's the fourth big theme that I wanted to present to you. And what I'd like to do very quickly, basically very short of time here, but what I want you to do was to talk about what it means and what companies should do in response and what strategy scholars have to think about in terms of our propositions and our advice to managers about how to deal with this new environment. So, as I said, greater flexibility is required. An example is that of, greater flexibility is required. An example is that of BMW moving to China in a bigger way in order to deal with the demand for X3s in China. They moved their factory from the US to Shenyang in China. In terms of adaptation to the local environment, companies have to get much better integrated in terms of local supply chains, in terms of local access to labor, in terms of becoming a member of the local societies, and in terms of even affecting regulation in local environments. So we are not able to treat the world, and this goes to the theme, a theme that Harbir also raised in terms of global convergence. So we're moving away from global convergence, and companies have to respond to that in terms of local integration. The third idea, and this is about the sovereignty at bay no longer being the dominant theme, but the nation state becoming ascendant. I talked about BMW, but notice that GE in Snecma, and when we were at INSEAD, we went to see the GE engine factory right outside INSEAD. And one of the questions people asked was, when we heard that GE was moving its most advanced engine factories to China, was, aren't you worried about spillovers and aren't you worried about corporate espionage? And the response was, we have to be where our customers are. So very much the idea of the local integration, very much the idea about the ascendancy of the nation state. And the last idea is, as I said, this concern that we are no longer able to see a set of laws that apply consistently across the board to everyone who follows a certain set of actions. Rather, it's a matter of picking and choosing, and you might say that we're moving from a nation of laws, certainly in America, to a nation of whims and fancies, and these are the whims and fancies of the president. And the response from companies is, of course, they are lobbying massively. There was a comment made in the press that Polaris is camping. Polaris is a snowmobile manufacturer based in Minnesota, which has a global operation, and it has camped out in DC because it wants to influence regulation in its favor. and the role of influence peddling is also increasing massively. So I've got some more stuff, but I think I'll leave you with that. So 4 big ideas as to how we deal with this new world. And again, we are moving from globally standardized strategies to much more flexibility in our global strategies. And of course, that means higher costs and lower profitability. So there is that trade-off, which is going to be inevitable. Much more local integration than simply adaptation, recognizing that the nation state has become much more powerful, and how do we bend to the whims of the nation states, which also means that we have to be much more responsive and much more aware that laws are going to be applied in a much more particularistic way than they may have been in the past. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ax. There will be time for questions at the end, and I'll just turn it over to Sri right now, and I might ask 1 or 2, but then we'll open it up. We have many scholars in the room who have lots of questions.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. I must start by saying that it's just an indication of how far the management consulting profession has fallen, that I've shown up without slides and not wearing a tie. So I really apologize for that, but I will actually make a few brief remarks. But let me start off by saying that, when I'm standing in front of a whole bunch of professors, I have this unnerving sense that somebody's going to ask for my grades or want to reopen some of the old papers that I wrote to figure out if I actually, passed credibly or not. What Shiv said about, by the way, I've been at Bain & Company, and I must say that I'm at Bain & Company and not Bain Capital. I'm not, the firm that gives out money. I'm hopefully the firm that receives money from other clients of ours. But I will say that, I've been a consultant for the past 22 years, ever since I left Wharton. I spent 10 years in our Boston office, the last 12 years over here. And I'm in the process of actually moving to our San Francisco office. But I must say that, the management consulting profession, Shiv was making some comments about this. And this is probably true for the strategy profession as well as the management consulting profession, that we tend to, create frameworks and jargon more than is necessary. And I think the patron saint for this profession is probably Alan Greenspan, who once said that if I turn out to be particularly clear, you have probably misunderstood me. So, but I must say that, our attempt over the years has always been to make sure that, and we have recognized this as a profession when we work with clients, that we tend to, overwhelm them with things that are not particularly relevant to the clarity of strategy. So let me make a few comments around, my experience, based on my experience. And I'll say that, I'll preface this by saying that, when I came here 12 years ago to India, after having spent 10 years in the US doing strategy consulting, I came with a set of concepts that many of you will recognize, which is really the importance of focus. The fact that, one should focus on the core, and that really one should leverage the core in terms of getting to scale, and I'll talk about scale in a minute. But even before I come and talk about scale, it was very apparent to me in my early days over here, back here, that when I spoke to the large multinationals, of which Shiv happens to work for one, that there was actually no respect for the fact that you needed to be in one business and really scale that business. In fact, the thesis was that over here, that you essentially needed to be in as many businesses as possible, and that was really the path to success. And every company that we went and spoke to and we talked about the importance of focus would say, but just look at Reliance. That continues to be the poster boy today. In fact, is even more of a poster boy for essentially lack of focusing on one sector because of what they've been able to do beyond petroleum, petrochemicals, retail, and now telecom. So for the last 12 years, we've been talking about the importance of focus, and we've been saying that there will come a day when capital allocation will become important and focus will become important. I must tell you that that day has not yet arrived in India. It may, And we may be at an inflection point, I don't know, especially as we have a new bankruptcy law and we have companies that are actually going through the bankruptcy process. This may be the inflection point, but I'm not calling it a victory yet. There are some global trends that, like automation, that are playing out here. So not everything is just local. The global trend in terms of automation is having a pretty significant impact. And industries are changing dramatically. You know, what do you do when your business models and ways of working are outmoded? And the famous saying is, no candle maker ever became a bulb manufacturer, and no carriage maker has ever become a car manufacturer. And so when you're in a business, when you're in a sector which is undergoing dramatic change, and you can see the wave coming because there are businesses, let's say in the western parts of the world or in western economies, that have been decimated by what's happened. You know, the tidal wave is coming onto you. What do you do? And you know, it's easy to talk about pivoting companies, but it's very difficult to do it. The legacy is not so much in terms of business models, but it's actually the legacy of culture. And that is actually, you know, the inertia of culture is very, very tough in my experience of working with companies. That what happens is that senior management has the will and the desire to talk about, you know, the lots of phrases that are used. Let's go into new businesses, let's create a new engine, and so on. But it becomes very difficult to actually execute on that when, you know, the entire organization is used to one way of working. And obviously, you know, there are companies that are trying very different things, including creating innovation funds in terms of investing in completely new businesses. But I would say that the jury is still out in terms of what model can and will be successful. The one thing that I think that, you know, people need to pay a lot of attention to in terms of the contrast, compare and contrast between Western economies and India, is really the aspect of capital, both the access to capital as well as the cost to capital. It makes a fundamental difference in terms of the way you think about running your business. When, you know, I was mentioning this earlier to Harbir, which is, there was an interview with Henry Kravis a few days ago when he was in India. And he talked about the fact that one of the big issues that companies in India have is the lack of a long-term bond market. And therefore, you're dependent on banks for capital, which is very different than in the United States, where you have different sources of capital. And so here, if you're a small or medium enterprise, you're really stuck. If you're like Shiv working for the Aditya Birla group, or you're working for the Tatas, your access to capital and potentially actually even your cost of capital is fundamentally different than if you're working for a small and medium enterprise. And the country intellectually recognizes that, you know, when you look at histories of economies around the world, especially in Western economies, the United States and Germany in particular, that growth and employment is going to come from the small and medium enterprise sector. And everybody recognizes that, but the institutional mechanisms that exist to support that in a place like India is actually still not there. The other big difference is really the aspect of activist investors. And in the US, it's increased, you know, during the time that I've been here back in India. And it's just, the activist investors are putting a lot of pressure on companies. I think the short-term outlook has always been there in terms of results in the US, but I think it's become even more exacerbated. And Shiv talked about this in passing, but I can tell you, you know, today in India, 80% of the work that Bain does is with promoters. When we came to India in 2006, our expectation was that most of the work that we would do, would be with MNCs. Actually, it's turned out to be the other way around. And one of the things that we've observed is that these families and promoters do actually have a much longer term perspective in terms of the way they think about business, both incubating and growing a business, than I would say Western companies have. There was a period between, I would say, 2008 to maybe even 2015 when MNCs completely exited India. They all believed in the promise of India, but they just didn't see the returns. And at that point of time, there was a strategy group somewhere that said, let's not even spend any time on India. There are key risks that one needs to consider when you think about India. There are key risks in terms of compliance. There's obviously the key risk in terms of infrastructure. And the one that's not talked about is actually around skills. And when you think about strategy and strategy implementation, skills, the skills aspect in India is actually one thing, is something to be really taken into account. I happened to be at a lunch on Friday in Delhi, and a group of people, CEOs, were talking about the fact that, people talk about all these engineering schools, and actually MBA schools as well, that exist in India that are turning out large numbers of people, but they don't really have the relevant skills to be productive, for companies. They don't have the skills that are required. And by the way, this is not just for companies like Bain Co. I happen to sit on the board of a logistics company in India that employs 25,000 people. And one would think, and they're probably hiring, 7,000, 8,000 people a year, and one would think that, for that skill set, it should not be a problem. But it is actually a problem to get people to do that. So the point around agility that Harbir talked about, which is really around, how do you make sure that companies are agile, I think is an important issue that we are all grappling with. Companies are grappling with it. We as consultants, advisors to our clients are grappling with it. But the aspect of how do you actually make it happen and how do you change that is actually, I think the models exist. There are many different models, but making that happen is actually the difficult part. I'll spend a few minutes, talking about private equity. One of the things that I do a lot of is advising private equity firms. I used to do that in the US, and I did a lot of that in India, and I sort of can compare and contrast. And one of the things I will tell you, there are many differences in terms of the way private equity operates in India versus the US. The one big one, and I won't spend too much time on it, is the fact that private equity in India, there are no majority controlled deals. There are very few buyouts. They tend to be minority controlled. 90% of the deals that happen in India are where the private equity firm takes an equity stake of around 26 to 30%. So what do you do in a situation where you have influence but no control, and the models of actually creating value are very different than in the US? But the one thing that I want to emphasize is that, just like in the US, where you are seeing more companies staying private for a longer period of time, it is true over here in India as well. That the rush to going public and the bar to go public used to be I think if you got to a $50 million size, you could get listed on the public markets over here. And there's somewhere in the range of 7,000 to 8,000 companies that are publicly listed in India. It's the largest number anywhere in the world. And many of them are subscale, and many of them have no business being listed. But one of the things that's happening that I've observed over the course of the last few years is that more and more companies are more comfortable because of the access to private capital and private equity, that they believe they have the option of staying private for much longer. And that actually has an implication in terms of how you think about scale and how you think about governance as well. The final point I want to make, and this is true across the board, is that the aspect of scale, which used to be a fundamental tenet, so GE's philosophy, Jack Welch's philosophy of you're either number one or number two, otherwise you don't be in the business. So the implication really was that you had to be a large player, otherwise you really had no business being in that industry or sector. And the belief was that you needed to have that scale so that you could actually go down the cost curve. And there were two different types of companies, one which lend themselves to scale, the others which lend themselves to differentiation and customer intimacy. What is happening clearly, and our observation from case studies not just in India but around the world, is that actually you need to have both. You can have both, but more importantly, you need to have both. And you're seeing company after company do this. And I think this is over the course of the last 3 years, this is actually, for me personally, the most interesting evolution from a strategy perspective. Obviously, everyone knows about Amazon and all the e-commerce companies that are able to do both, that have the scale but also have the customer intimacy to, for example, when they render a page, when you log on, it shows up the list of products that you specifically are interested in based on your prior pattern or anything else. But you see it actually in bricks and mortar as well, and Starbucks is an example of that. An example of a company that has global scale but also is delivering customer intimacy in a very meaningful way. So I'll just leave that thought with you. And for us, actually, how do companies, our clients, how do they progress in a way where they have the benefits of scale but they also deliver customer intimacy in a very meaningful way? That actually is the challenge that we're grappling with. Thank you.
Thanks, Sri. Wonderful. So we'll just have a few points to discuss on the panel, but we will definitely open it up to everyone very quickly. So, one thought, Sri, I had was corporate governance has been changing rapidly, and let me just offer a couple of statistics. I mean, in India and in the U.S. So while we sort of in the U.S. have this a major business framework called the principal agent model, which roughly addresses half the courses in a business school, and maybe the resource-based or some such view addressing the other half. It turns out that the ownership structure of most public corporations has dramatically changed, with Vanguard and BlackRock and State Street owning as much as 10% of most public companies around in the US. So the notion of managers pursuing own agendas and owners having not much voice, that has actually been changing under our very eyes. So that's in the US. In India, we have this interesting concept of business groups, and some business groups thriving and others actually declining. So the question for you, Sri, in your work is, what are some of the ways in which corporate governance in India could perhaps increase transparency? Because we saw in a very public fight with the Tata Group, and also a public fight with Infosys, two of the most admired entities in India.
Yeah. I don't know if this is working. Is this working? Okay. So I think, Harbir, I'll separate the question into two parts. One is the need for transparency, and the other is whether it'll happen or not. I think the need for transparency, the case for transparency exists. I think people do want more and more transparency. One of the things that private equity firms, when they invest in Indian companies, will say is that what we're going to bring to the table is really Western governance practices. That whether it's management systems, whether it's processes, whether it's public disclosures, all of that, they need to do it in any case because they have their LPs that they need to cater to. But in many instances, actually, I'll be honest with you, Indian promoter-run families are not looking necessarily for increased transparency. What they're looking for, I mentioned this to you earlier in our conversation, Harbir, and I forgot to mention it over here. But what we've seen over the course of the last 10, 15 years in India has been an era of a land grab, where there are sectors that are opening up that people feel that if they don't participate, they're going to be left out. And there have been many where they've burned their hands, whether it's real estate or telecom, and there are many where they've been successful. But there the belief is that I'm not entirely sure that I want to have a level of disclosure where if I go and put a lot of money into a completely new business, I want to have public shareholders questioning me as to whether I should be doing that or not. What I really want is a set of investors who will back me no matter what I do, hopefully because I've delivered for them in the past, and they will believe that I will deliver for them in the future. So hopefully that answers your question.
So yeah, in a sense, what you are suggesting, which is very interesting, is that most of the default model for strategy classes is the freestanding public company.
Yeah.
And in India, what you see is a significant part, more than 50% of the economy, is in a business group where you naturally have this idea of investing in multiple businesses.
Yes.
And then there's, and one of the answers is bridging institutional voids, which of course makes sense. But I think later work that has been done by some people in this room, Fanish and Prashant and Ravi Chittur and others, is the notion of more successful and less successful business groups. So what is the competence that you need to actually perform better in a business group setting? I'll give you just one quick example which struck me as really quite powerful. Reliance Jio, which is really transforming the telecom industry today, is really all internally generated capital invested into 200,000 kilometers, again, 200,000 kilometers of new fiber optic cable in India to create a 4G network that on infrastructure just puts everybody else in a defensive posture, right? And if it was a freestanding public company issuing a bond offering to do this, it probably would not happen.
Actually, that was the point I was thinking about when I made the earlier point, which is that they have invested close to between $30 to $35 billion into creating this telecom enterprise. And it is the most expensive telecom startup anywhere in the world. We have the lowest prices anywhere in the world in terms of telecom. And I would say, I think everyone would agree in this room that this may not have happened in a developed market, where, you know, if there had been a company that wanted to go invest, it was originally $14 billion, became 25, and now, you know, beyond $30 billion in terms of the investment. I don't think that, you know, shareholders would have. Today, you have an activist shareholder who's forcing Nestle to sell a small part of the business because he doesn't believe it actually fits in with the rest. I mean, if that's happening on one side, on the other side, you have a company that's investing $30 billion into a telecom venture. It's a completely different contrast in terms of the way people think about, well, lots of things. Everything from governance to the long-term view to lots of other things.
So we'll get to questions in just a second. And thanks, Sri, that was very, very enlightening. So Axe, in fact, this feeds right into your, you know, your globalization versus regionalization or particularism. And of course, whenever you put Trump in the title, everybody pays attention. So, but I think this is an example of sort of doing work that perhaps looks at regional or local institutional factors and what kinds of strategies might emerge that are unique to them but may inform global scholars, right? And so, comments on that.
Yeah, so I was, this is working. So I was, you know, just thinking as you were talking, Shri, in terms of,
Is the mic? No, they can't hear you.
Let's just use a handheld mic.
So I was just, you know, thinking as you were talking about going to the core and staying within the core, and this whole notion of the business group, which really speaks to the institutional voids in India. And, you know, the way I see what you were saying is that the institutional voids in India are not going away anytime soon. And of course, what that means for global strategy is that the strategies in particular countries, in particular India, have to be really tailored to the Indian context to an even greater extent. And in general, the convergence is not happening. And so local integration has to be stronger still. But the one point I wanted to make, which I briefly touched on earlier as well when we were talking, is that the institutional voids being stronger and not going away anytime soon also means that the role of the business group, which adds the protection, the buffering of an internalized capital market, makes even more sense in an economy such as India's, where these institutional voids are not going away anytime soon.
Yeah.
And the more potent the institutional voids are, the more sense it makes. So the land grab that you were talking about, you know, makes perfect sense, because what they're really bringing to the table is access to capital, is access to government contacts, is access to higher quality skills, which you also talked about.
Yeah.
And it is, you know, not a competitive marketplace institutionally or even otherwise in the markets, which needs, you know, companies to focus on the core and, you know, transfer skills that are relevant to that core in this kind of environment. So
I'll just make one comment on that, which is that. So my belief is, yes, I do believe that these institutional voids, whether it's structural, institutional, whatever, the structural one is, like, say, for example, the long-term bond market that I talked about. That's a structural issue. You call it institutional, whatever you call it, right? But anyway, so my point is that I think some of these things will continue to exist for a while. There could be a point, there could be a tipping point at some point of time, and we won't even know. I can't predict it. My sense is nobody will be able to predict it, and at some point of time, you know, what will happen is that many of these conglomerates will find that they just don't have access to the capital to compete in lots and lots of places. An example of that is the Tata, if that is a Tata group that's discovering now that it doesn't have the ability to compete in every single industry that it's in. They're trying to find ways to do that, but, you know, maybe we'll see whether they're successful or not, and they will be successful in the ones that they focus on. But there may be a tipping point where people feel that, you know, I just have to focus on 3 or 4, I can't focus on 10 or 12. When that will happen, I don't have a sense. I don't have a crystal ball on that. But I do think that over the course of the near term, we will have this, whether it's institutional void, lack of certain structural mechanisms, whatever that might be, that will continue to exist, that will give the benefit to the large conglomerates.
So just to follow up, what would make that time come sooner when they realize that they are now being pushed to focus, or they're being pushed to stay with their core? Is that a structural, is that the filling of the institutional void? Is it the structural, bond market coming into play, coming into being?
Yeah.
Or is it another
I think it's really, we're starting to see that a little bit because of the opening up of markets, of sectors. Right. So what is happening is that, as sectors are opening up, as multinational corporations are coming in and competing with deep pockets playing for the long run, I think that is naturally getting people to think a little bit about, for each of the businesses that they're in, do they have the ability to win in the long term or not? That, I think that the market forces in my mind will really be the key driver for that.
So one of the, and I'm going to go to a question right away after this, but one of the great levelers that we are seeing in global markets is in fact the value proposition to the end consumer. And in fact, a lot of people who, I was at a conference on corporate governance, and it was really about global corporations. And one of the points I came across, which I had not ever thought about, was that the drive towards sort of customer knowledge of particular value propositions in different markets has resulted in the search for cost reduction globally, and then that in turn has actually put capital allocation as the #1 task of boards in the United States today. It's more than monitoring. Our theories around monitoring, but the #1 task that board members are worried about in the US today is capital allocation, and specifically understanding what is the true cost of capital for that particular project, because that's industry specific, not firm specific. And I think that may be the force that might sort of militate against the business group structure that we see in India today. And Shiv actually talked about that. So with that, let me open it up to the audience. Lots of good, yes, please, go ahead. And can we also bring a mic to the back? There's somebody waiting in the back. Let's take this question here.
Thank you. Hi, this is Pavan Lindok from ISB. My question is predominantly to Sri, but happy for other panelists to also. And if I could seek your permission to seek your reaction to two propositions. One is the discussion you just had, which was framed around transparency and institutional voids. How would you react to a provocative proposition that seems a very American-centered view, and that perhaps an alternative frame is that it's really the division between public versus and more patient, private capital and more patient capital pools versus the limitations of timeframes in public capital markets, because you see similar behaviors in Amazon and SoftBanks, far more opaque and hard to read conglomerates than anything that you could mention in the Indian context. And the second proposition, do you think, given all of the increasing fragility and competition, are we actually getting to the point of starting to question the limits of scale and overreach, that unless you have access to true digital increasing incremental returns types of economics, if your business is largely in conventional diminishing return, incremental return types of businesses, perhaps you shouldn't be getting as big as, or sort of just continuing the quest for growth as previously was the question?
Okay, I think that the first question was very provocative, and I completely take the point. I think, yes, I think we sometimes apply a Western mindset to the way we think about Indian companies, and I think one way to think about this is in terms of patient capital. Whether it's Amazon or whether it's anybody else, I think it's entirely the right frame to think about it. I do think the point I was making, though, is that it was in response to the question about the transparency. I think it's applicable to Amazon as well, which is that when you go and invest in a whole bunch of businesses, and it was true for Google before it became Alphabet, before they sort of separated Google from the rest of Alphabet. I think, if you want to have shareholders have clear line of sight into what is happening in different businesses, then you probably do want greater transparency in terms of the different operations. But I would agree with you that I think that it would have been very difficult for a public any other publicly listed company to have gone and invested as much as they do. And we keep talking about, Reliance and Telecom, but by the way, this is true for lots of other groups and lots of other companies and lots of other sectors that they've invested in. So I think it's more around, where is the balance of what is it that you want to deliver for your shareholders in terms of transparency. The second point, I'll just give a quick response, and I made this in my comments, which is I actually think that the strategic struggle that we are going through, when we advise clients is how do you have both? Our belief is you need to have scale. You cannot be in a position where you have to compete against somebody else who has the scale, and scale also enables you to have the differentiation and the customer intimacy that I talked about. So at least my belief, and maybe that's not the Bain belief, but my belief is that actually you need to have both, and you can have both. You can have businesses that are delivering purely customer intimacy, and that's obviously true. But if you want to really be a large-scale business, you need to have the benefits of scale as well. And the unit of scale can be different. That we can talk about separately.
Yeah.
Charles?
Sri, you mentioned about TCS and Tata Group trying to sharpen the numbers and it will take some time. And you find it consistently in many of the groups, like even though they're like AB, Shiv is left, but AB has been, Aditya Birla has been struggling with the telecom side.
Yes.
So there is a resistance to exit. Where do you see where it's coming? How can we, is there a way to get the strategic leaders to be much more open to exit? Is there something that you see where we need to push?
And that, by the way, may well be a global question, right? Because there's plenty of evidence in the US. The one transaction that creates more than 50% of the time creates economic value is divestiture. Yet in the US also people don't divest as much as they acquire. So broader question, but in India specifically.
Yeah, and I was telling you, 22 years ago, I sat in Harbir's class and we spent an entire semester talking about divestitures. but I'll say that, my belief is that when you look at the data actually, or the analysis, what they call it, data analysis, if someone were to do the analysis, the answer seems pretty clear. I think in many instances, it's a combination of hope and ego that prevents people from making the tough call. The hope being that, we will find a way to, work our way out of this. And the ego being that, we've invested a lot in the business. I'm not sure that I want to give it up, right? And so I think, I'll tell you the one thing, I've worked a lot with families and promoters over here in India. And the one thing I'll say is that the level of attachment that they have to the business, it's a psychological attachment that they have to the business is enormous. So in many instances, they're making decisions that you and I might say is not completely rational. But it's not just to the business, and I must tell you this, they also have a very strong attachment to the employees in those businesses. They believe, there's so many conversations I've had where the promoter has said, I believe I owe it to the people, who have staked their careers and livelihoods by coming to work for me. And I will not make the call. It's at the individual level, it's also at the company level. It's a very different mindset than, the activist investor.
Very good. So maybe we'll take one more question. Thank you for that. Actually, you want to say anything?
So So I just want to say that, so you're saying that the business groups are much less likely to divest and much less likely to exit than public companies that are not part of business groups and Western companies in general.
That's my belief as of now, based on what I know.
Yeah. Because we also know that some of this is just escalating commitments, which is one of the standard biases that Kahneman talks about, and getting out of any failing course of action is going to be hard.
Yeah.
But in India, it's
a human tendency made deeper by.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm hoping that none of this is actually going to be telecast on CNN or CNBC or anything like that. But I'll just say, you look at the case of telecom in the Tata Group, right? They've lost somewhere in the range of 35,000 crores. I don't know what the number is. I think the answer of I think the answer was pretty clear many years ago, and one would say that why would you stay on as long as you did? So anyway, I think in many instances the answers are clear and obvious, And then one question, I think the question you're asking is the right one, which is, why does it take so long to get to the final execution of the answer? I don't know.
So we have one more question, and then we'll have a 1 minute wrap up from each of our two panelists. Yes.
This question is really an attempt to peer into the future. Let's say 2-3 years from now, there's a worldwide recession. And let's say also technology really increases at such a rate that there's tremendous substitution of human labor. And in this scenario, recession plus greater digitization, what do you think would be the conclusions that you drew, or the trends that you saw? What new trends do you think would take place? What scenarios would play out in this setting that would change strategic leadership?
Maybe I can start. I would say, so a couple of themes that did not come up just because we were focusing on what's new and different in this context is the idea of exploration and exploitation and balancing the two. And I think also the idea that was briefly mentioned, the idea of ecosystems. If we take those two things, when it comes to artificial intelligence and those kinds of things, and will it substitute a lot of labor? I think, of course, no one really has the answer today. And so if we look at what we know from our research, it would mean that the firms most at risk need to have some exploratory activity on how to actually incorporate AI and what the ramifications might be, so that they are not caught like Kodak was with digital and having to, in effect, become untenable. And I place a lot of stock on that, by the way. If you think about Microsoft, Shivakumar was talking about all these companies that exited. Microsoft has been a leader in the top few in every decade. And that's because Microsoft actually balances exploration and exploitation very well. Towards the end of the career of the previous CEO, Microsoft had begun to miss the mobile app, but then I think Satya Nadella came and was able to build cloud and so on. And that was really because of lack of enough exploration that they were almost at risk in their core business. So that will be one quick answer. And if not, let's go with the 1 minute summaries.
So I just wanted to actually wrap up by saying, what are the strategic imperatives for tomorrow? And I think one of them, as Sri was quite rightly saying, is that companies have to deal with both scale as well as customer intimacy. That's too, of course, we have seen in the past. Now, in the sense that the idea of being a transnational is fundamentally a combination of scale and customer intimacy. In fact, I have a student in my class who's just suffered through my class in June, and we talked about Samsung, which deals with both scale and customer intimacy all at the same time, and the notion of the dual strategy idea. So of course that is paramount. We've got to be able to deal with both, and how do we deal with them is the question. And again, as we also are, informed by, as Pawan was quite rightly saying, the strategy which is an Amazon-type strategy, which is a digital strategy, and which is an internet strategy, allows you to much more easily deal with both customer intimacy and scale all at the same time. But then the question is, well, how are we going to deal with the Amazons from China? And how are we going to deal with competition across digital platforms in, say, India? And that is, a challenge that that strategy faces going forward as well.
So I'll wrap up by, partly responding to the point that was made. I think what is very clear is that even if you don't even talk about more advanced technologies like AI, for example, just simple automation. I have an automotive client that's going to double capacity in the next 3 years with a net reduction in headcount. And this is true in client after client of ours, in industry after industry. And just simple automation is actually increasing productivity, reducing the need for labor. And this is true not just for manufacturing, but in services as well. And it wasn't too long ago that I was reading articles about the fact that the transnational corporation was supplanting the nation state as a center of power, in the world. And I completely agree with Professor Zaheer that, the nation state is the revenge of the nation state, so to speak. I think what is going to be very important for companies to think about is, they have to talk about what is their role in society and what is it that they're doing to advance the cause of the country and society. I was having a conversation actually on Friday with the head of Amazon in India, and we were talking about the fact that one of the things that he does is actually does a lot of sourcing from India. Now, I'm not suggesting that's a deliberate strategy. Obviously, it benefits, the customers around the world. But when they talk about, their India strategy, it's not just talking about the number of customers that they have over here, but it's also about how they're using India as a sourcing base for their customers around the world. Mm-hmm. And so I would say that, part of what companies really need to think about is that it's not, irrespective of whatever activist investors might want to do, and the focus on the top line and the bottom line and all of that, in terms of what they need to present, to make sure that they're not going to be hampered by governments or the regulatory framework, is to make sure that they can talk about their relevance in the context of society and countries. So that would be my point.
Thanks, Sri. I just wanted to make one call for research for our academics in the room based on what we heard, and that is, in my own personal journey, a few years ago, I was actually drawn into a project looking at Indian strategic leaders, and we interviewed 100 CEOs of the 150 biggest companies and did field-based research. And it was actually very, very informative, and we got some unique elements of the Indian context. And then later on, a book on Chinese leaders, and what I learned from there, which came out last year, we interviewed 72 of the 100 leaders of the 100 largest private companies in China. What we learned there was the agility that they have in China is unmatched. If you look at peer companies in other geographies. And so the call I'm going to make is twofold. Number one, I think all our journals require good empirical research designs. But the call I'll make is doing field work, even if you don't publish that, because then you can design your experiments a lot better. And I think this rigor versus relevance is perhaps an artificial trade-off, that the field research allows you to actually come up with a design that will in fact be rigorous and have some compelling conclusions. And the last point I'll make is for the field, I think the field is very much alive, but I do think, I often think, what are 10, and this is just a question for us, what are 10 stylized facts that we all agree upon in strategy that we will tell MBAs all over the world? And I would welcome that conversation in the breaks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for an insightful blend of academic and industry perspective on disruption and global competition. I would now like to invite Professor Rishikesh Krishnan to present the mementos to our panelists. Professor Rishikesh Krishnan, Director and Professor of Strategy at IIM Indore, is one of our 4 program chairs for this conference.
Thank you, Ax. Really wonderful comment. I think you guys are